Rethinking Education, the video series where I talk to some of the most interesting voices in education and explore their ideas on teaching and learning. I'm Dominic Traynor. I'm a teacher and one of Adobe's education evangelists, and in this video I'll be talking to David Price, OBE. He's a learning futurist and author of the best-selling book Open, and we'll talk about how we'll live, learn and work in the future. And that's something that's a lot closer now thanks to COVID-19 than it ever has been before. So we're in interesting times. So let's see what David has to say for himself. Thanks for turning up, David. That's the first thing. Always a pleasure to see you. Always a pleasure to see you. And yeah, so we've got a bit of an opportunity here. It's an interesting time, isn't it, with school closures happening, and it's a really interesting time for us to have a little rethink on schools and what they're about and what they should be doing and on what direction they should be going in. And I know that you've done a lot of work on that. Maybe you could give us like a quick intro into, because I've already told people a general overview of you and your work, but particularly your book Open and how we'll live, learn and work in the future. Maybe you could give us a brief overview of your kind of thoughts and feelings about the
Sure.
work that you do.
Yeah, let's preface it all by saying we'll look back on history, and there'll be a period before Corona and a period after Corona. So right now it's really hard to see what's going to happen, but it will, I believe, be the most significant thing in a century. And how we react to that, including schools, is both a massive challenge, but also an opportunity. And I guess, in a sense, what I was saying in Open was kind of almost in preparation for this moment, which is to say, knowledge is everywhere now. It's been like this now for 10 years. Schools, I think, have sometimes struggled with the informality of that process. And I'm not just talking about online learning, but obviously that's, what happens in the social space is huge. What I think they've struggled with is the fact that there is a whole other world which their students are into that they probably don't even know about. And it used to be that if you wanted to learn anything, you had to be in a school or in a library. But now it can be anywhere. And what I was trying to say in Open was, let's embrace that. Let's find ways of integrating that passion and enthusiasm that people have got when they're doing work that matters in collaboration with other people. And so here we are. It's been forced upon us in a sense.
Yeah, become available, but now people are sort of turning their heads and focusing on that perhaps in a way that they were never doing before. And I think there is a really interesting sort of paradigm to see, is there going to be a huge shift to where schools kind of embrace that kind of thing rather than...
But I think the challenge will be, there's never been a problem with content. Clay Shirky once said it's not information overload, it's filter failure that we're dealing with. So we now have even more content, and what schools need to avoid, I think, is simply trying to replicate schooling but in an online space. We've got an opportunity not just to change the content of what's being learned, but the way in which it's being learned. And in a sense, not having examinations could be a hugely liberating process. But I think we have to recognize that what has fired our students up over this past 3 to 4 weeks, it feels like a lot longer, but what's really inspired them has been to apply the learning to the pandemic. And that to me is a lesson. So there's a school in Rochdale called Matthew Moss High School. They've now access, because it's all available, this stuff now. It's been really interesting to see the shift in intellectual property when we're faced with an existential threat. Suddenly everything's gone open source, which is great. What it means is that students are turning up, those students of key workers who are still turning up at school are saying, forget filling in worksheets. Let's make some face shields. And the students at Matthew Moss are now making them and distributing them around GPs and surgery. And you think about the learning that goes in, the physics that you need in terms of how you 3D print a face shield, the chemistry that you need to understand. There's a huge amount of learning, but at the same time, they're doing something vital.
Yeah, well, it's learning for purpose, isn't it? Because you think the amount of educational shows you've probably been to, or maybe you've given up going to them these days, but where you see like 3D printers and they're making key rings, and you think, well, interesting, but probably completely useless. And you think, well, this is really an opportunity to grab learning learning with purpose and really make it work.
Yeah.
Okay, so sorry, I interrupted you there.
No, go on.
So one of the things I thought we'd do was, I sent over some questions to you before, and I thought we'd just go through them. And certainly let's not restrict ourselves to these, but they're a good place for us to start.
Sure.
And structure the conversation. So the first question was, are schools preparing children for the future, and what kind of future can students look forward to? And I think in the context now, this is an open field, isn't it?
Absolutely. And how we put the world back together again after all of this is the billion-dollar question, because everything is changing at lightning speed. And you mentioned my last book. I thought I'd finished writing my next book, which is called We'll Figure It Out, Mass Ingenuity and the Power of Us. And it's been sent off to the publisher, and I just feel like I'm live blogging now, because every hour there's another example of some incredible act of ingenuity, on timescales that we couldn't have dreamt. Building a hospital in a week.
I mean, the time lapse of that was absolutely mind blowing.
Yeah,
it really was.
It's staggering, and so if we can do all that as a species when we're really up against it, are we really going to go back to that kind of form of neoliberalism where it's every man for himself and devil take the hindmost? Surely we've got to learn from that. And I think our students had enough to worry about in terms of the world to come. If you look at the climate emergency, if you look at the threat from automation, and now we've got this, which is going to be the biggest recession we've seen in well over 100 years. And they're the ones who are going to have to fix all this. Having said that, I think that schools have responded incredibly well. To go back to your question, I think the challenge has been, and it's not schools' fault, but they've really been preparing students for the past. By that I mean our entire system is predicated on can we get young people to be able to remember routine chunks of information and then repeat it when necessary. And we've got computers that can do that so much better. So let's think now, when we're looking at the futures, can we get our young people to be the problem solvers? Can we give them these huge societal challenges? And can we see that that's the purpose of schooling? Because it isn't an either or. We can remake the world and learn at the same time.
Well, exactly. I suppose it's that balance between assessments and actually doing something which is needed or is necessary or whatever. And I think obviously schools have been under that pressure to if they're judged on results, you can't expect them to do anything but try and deliver on those results. And I think this exam cancellation is probably one of the most interesting things that I've seen in education. And I wonder whether will we just slip back into the old sort of, let's just carry on with assessments as we did it before? What kind of shift do you want to see in terms of how schools tackle things?
Well, in a sense, the shift was already starting to happen. I just hope it'll be accelerated. So I'm an advisor to a thing called the Mastery Transcript Initiative, which is a kind of digital portfolio base, and it started in America, but it's becoming a global movement now. It's actually they're piloting now the first schools and the first universities, and the universities are getting really excited because when you look at a student's strengths in terms of their ability to collaborate, their leadership skills, it tells you much more about that student than, you know, a grade point average of 3.9 ever did. So that was starting to happen. I think the opportunity that has come along now is huge, because we could be starting to think about a portfolio. You know, I mean, in Open, I quoted Laszlo Bock from Google, who always says, you know, the world doesn't care about what you know anymore. It cares about what you can do with what you know. Yeah. So could we refashion an assessment system which is about performance, which is about what you can make and what you can do to with the knowledge that you've got? But we can't underestimate there are huge vested interests. Yeah. And the challenge is going to be, you know, people are complaining already about being put out of business. The exam boards could be the next ones. You know, they could say, well, we're going to have to lay people off if you're going to do a portfolio base. I don't see why it should be. I think it's a case of refashioning the existing structures, because I'm not against accountability. I think we've got to be able to...
I think that's important to say, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah,
it's important to say it's not about... I think when everyone talks about assessment, we should do it differently. So, you know, we can't get rid of assessment. It's not about getting rid of assessment. It's about changing how we assess. I suppose playing devil's advocate, one of the things that I might say is that if you're doing sort of you know, a standard traditional exam sort of type of assessment, then there are ways in which you can automate that and automate the results. You know, work them out a lot quicker than you would do normally, and you know, perhaps this kind of new kind of portfolio approach to assessment is a lot more nuanced, isn't it? It's a lot more nuanced, and it very much comes down to I guess kind of personal opinion on what someone thinks is valuable, what somebody that would probably be a big challenge, I would imagine.
Yes, it would, but you know, if the last 3 weeks has taught us anything, it's taught us that the technology is there. You know, we can fix these things really quickly when we put our minds to it. The second thing, it seems to me, is that it's shown us what really counts. You know, the most frequently asked question now that a student gets asked when they're given a piece of work is, does it count? And we know what they mean by that. Is it going to be part of the exam? What are the marks associated with that? Well, to go back to that example that I cited earlier, having kids making face shields for doctors in Greater Manchester, does that count? You know, you bet it does. And when we've now got, you know, I saw in today's news, Russia sending America relief aid. Who thought that was ever going to happen? You know, Chinese doctors are flying into America. This understanding that we are all one species is an incredible opportunity. And again, this was already starting to be flagged up. So PISA 2 years ago was hardly reported upon, but they introduced a further assessment, which was a thing called global competency, which is really about, do you understand other cultures? How aware are you of the differences between us, and how aware of you of the similarities in our culture, in our history? The last 3 weeks have shown that that's so important. You know, and you've got the President of America who's gone from calling this the Wuhan flu or the Chinese flu to now he's a much more sober individual, and he is in receipt of foreign aid from the very countries he's being attacking. So, you know, people might say, what's that got to do with schooling? But I think it's got everything to do with it, because we have this opportunity now to really create global citizens who can fix not just this problem, because the climate emergency hasn't gone away. It's maybe been eased a bit, which is another remarkable thing to have come out of this. You know, being able to see that there are fish in Venetian canals. Who knew? And the air quality around Beijing, all of these things have improved. And we then have to say, so are we just going to go back to polluting? Is that what we do now? And there'll be enormous pressure on that. But fortunately, I just think, I don't know what your experience is of today's students, but I find them ethically and morally conscious in ways that I never was when I was a kid.
Yeah, certainly, definitely.
I think that they're incredibly optimistic given the challenges that they're facing. And so when I look at it, I do believe we will figure this out. And with this generation, when they're in the 30s and 40s, I just hope they keep this passion and moral compass that they seem to have. Because frankly, they're teaching baby boomers like us a lesson.
Yeah, so I think you're right. I think they are going to teach us a lesson, or at least I hope they will be in a position where they'll tell us that they've taught us a lesson. That would be like the absolute best sort of case scenario. But I think one of the things that's sort of I've been thinking about at the moment is if we say, for example, that's what we want from our current crop of students and students to come, then if we said that school isn't coming back until September, I think that's quite realistic, I would say.
Oh, yeah.
It might be sooner, fingers crossed. But if we say they're going to come back in September, I think we're in a situation where the current system, with all of its quirks and characteristics, is still going to exist in some way, shape, or form, isn't it? Like, it's not going to, Babylon's not going to be burnt down, by the time we go back to school. So, in September, what kind of are there certain things that you would want to see in schools, happening? Maybe sort of not like absolutely massive shifts, which would require, like complete rethinking. But what are some are there some easy wins that we can make? I mean, I've got certain ideas, but I'd be really interested to hear what kind of things would you want to see happening in schools, say from September when they go back?
Well, that's a great question because so many students are not in school. Some are. They're getting a kind of twin track experience right now, some very different experiences. So that's going to be a challenge. Getting them back on the same page, I think, is going to be a challenge. Or it could be an opportunity, because it seems to me we've now got the kids who are attending school are not being taught in classes according to their age. They're mixed in. So all of these things that we've been talking about stage, not age, about doing kind of meaningful work, that we've got the opportunity to start to do some of these. But of course, we've also got teachers who are absolutely exhausted and are working around the clock. They probably aren't even thinking too much about what's going to happen in September. And inevitably, there will be, I guess, in some cases, people will just be saying, we've had so much change thrown at us. Can we just have a period where we can get back to business as usual? That, I think, is something that we have to resist. And I think with the best will in the world, if, the first year after this, because this is going to go on for some time, maybe 3-4 years, and then you've got the recession that will follow it. So I think we've got a number of things which we've got to have prioritized. The first is the mental health of not just our students but our teachers, because that's going to be affecting all of us. This is we've never lived like this before, and it's going to get worse. And everybody will know somebody, sadly, who didn't make it through. So that's a colossal amount of grieving, which it seems to me, it's going to be necessary. We've got to protect the mental well-being of our students. But I think we've also got to somehow get our collective minds around what could a more phased and a more integrated approach look like? Because it would be utterly ridiculous, it seems to me, having switched, which almost every school in the world has done overnight, to delivering it online. If we just said, oh well, we can forget about all that now, I mean, that would just be crazy. So that to me is an immediate opportunity, because we've already got the content now. You know, people have been developing this content at great speed. Let's not waste that, but let's also, as I say, let's see how the 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 opportunity for rethinking the world can actually start in schools. You know, and how is that going to work in terms of our local businesses, for example? You know, we're seeing really interesting collaborations across industry now, across disciplines. We've seen that when that happens, when people from various disciplines, you know, who'd have thought that Tesla would be making ventilators? You know,
Yeah.
but it's happening. The Formula One people who've built those CPAP machines in less than a week, working alongside doctors. Who would have thought car engineers would be working with that? But if that's how we've managed to respond in this incredible way, then surely we've got to think, why are we just teaching, you know, an hour of geography followed by an hour of chemistry?
Right.
Just
So these
doesn't
subject
make
silos
sense.
are something that you think. I mean, yeah, it was an
Absolutely.
interesting. I was thinking a lot about this, and I think, you know, to some extent there is some value in, you know, in drills and things like that, but at some point you have to give them students the opportunity to actually apply those different skills in different areas to one sort of collaborative project. Is that how you
Yeah.
would go
No,
about things?
absolutely. And if I had, you know, an 18-year-old right now, I'd be sending them off to the interdisciplinary school in London, which is a new university set up by the people who set up School 21.
Yeah.
It has no single discipline degrees. It works on big world problems. So, you know, how do we fix malaria? Those people must be thinking, my God, we were meant for this moment,
Yeah.
because the problems that are going to need to be addressed after this, because this won't be the last pandemic. And as a society, we've got to be better prepared in the future. So, what better than to send your kid to somewhere that is working on these real world problems and getting a degree at the end of it? As I say, it needn't be an either or.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you talk about the sort of the assessment industry, and it's kind of like, you know, is there going to be? I mean, certainly in some areas there will be like huge value in having, you know, like an English A level, or, you know, a Chinese GCSE or whatever. You know,
Sure.
there is still value, but I mean, I always think about the PwC like CEO survey, which had creativity as its number one thing at the top, and yet that is something that, as if you do work in subject silos, it's really sort of, it's much more of a challenge, isn't it, to bring creativity in when
Yeah.
you're restricted to one kind of output or one kind of subject.
Sure. Absolutely. But it can be done, and there are schools around the world who are already doing it. And this is the interesting thing about it, you know, is that we don't have to rethink this from scratch. You know, we've had Minerva University where all of the lectures have been online, where the students are moving around the world to study in different places to get that cultural understanding, and they're doing internships with, you know, major corporations. That's been going on for the past 5 years. So we've sort of got the blueprint for a lot of this already. We just need to scale it up now, because we it seems to me it would just be crazy to go back to business as usual.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, one of the things you talked about just before then was talking about getting businesses into schools. And I think, you know, maybe 6 months ago, that would have been something that schools would have found quite daunting. And now you think, you know, particularly with, you were talking about that school in Rochdale, was it,
Yeah,
who were
yeah.
making the face masks. Like, so like when September comes, you know, comes around, and hopefully people are going back to school, What is that kind of ideal way that you see businesses interacting with schools?
Well, uh, this is not meant to be critical of schools, but I think we'd have to accept that typically the relationship that we've had with the business community has been a one-way traffic, and it's been, could someone come in and give a talk, or could you do a careers fair, or or
I
could
get asked that all
could
the
you give
time.
us some money? Yeah,
Yeah, it's one way.
absolutely.
Mm.
Uh, why don't we view this as an opportunity to say, could you help us redesign the curriculum, so that it is more relevant to the kind of future skills and future needs that we're going to have? The people are talking around this concept of a learning ecosystem, that schools can't really do this on their own anymore. So can we get a two-way traffic going? And also, what can we do for employers? What can we offer them? We've got great teachers. They don't always have to teach in school. We've got students who are desperate to work on real world problems. Could you help them with that? There's a number of schools that I work with in Australia where they are designing a kind of place-based curriculum which is around the needs of not just their business community, but their local council, their community groups. The outpouring of mutual aid that we've seen in the last 3 weeks is an incredible opportunity for our students now to really take, what the Americans call service-based learning seriously. And when you look
Just
at
explain to us what service-based learning is.
so service-based learning would be you are learning, but you're doing it in a way which is helping other people.
Right.
So at its most tokenistic, it would be I don't know, visiting, going to a care home and putting on a performance. Yeah,
Yeah.
Which is fine. I'm not knocking that, but it can be so much more. So there's a school in India that I work with called Silverdale, and they have a thing called Each One Teach One, and these are independent, quite wealthy schools where the kids have got a moral responsibility, because they can read really well, to go out into the poorer villages and teach other kids how to read. Now, you could say, well, where's the learning in that? The kids get the best exam results in the whole of New Delhi, 27 million people. So something clearly works. And with all of this mutual aid which has been going on, we've seen how powerfully people have been able to self-organize, and kids have been involved in all of this. So can we then say, well, how can we then reconstruct the curriculum so that it meets the needs of our community, as well as teaches us the kind of disciplinary knowledge that we need? And like
it's interesting, isn't it?
Schools
Because
are doing it.
yeah, because this situation at the moment has meant that actually communities have got to know each other. Like they're like, oh, you're my neighbor. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't even know you existed. And you think how over a certain amount of time, and I don't know what that sort of amount of time is, we've kind of slowly but surely sort of alienated ourselves from community. Perhaps the internet has had part of that. The digital experience has part of part of that responsibility. But generally, one of the really interesting things now is that we have the sort of the technology in place, all the digital stuff in place, and now we're actually coming back to community. And wouldn't it be a real shame if we got back to some kind of normality and suddenly it was like we forget about that person down the road?
And to a certain extent, some of that will be inevitable. But can you imagine what it's going to feel like when we can actually go to the local pub and meet people and talk to people? I think it's just we're going to realise, what we'd lost in the process. And isn't it ironic that by locking us up in our houses, we've actually got to know our neighbours better?
Yeah,
it's a real weird paradox. But you're right. I think there's been Twitter's become a more compassionate place now, and the Edelman Trust Barometer, which they do every year, showed that 2020, so this was at the start of the year in January, before all this broke, they reported that this was the worst year globally for trust. We've regularly not trusted our governments. We have lost trust in our media. And what they were reporting is that we're actually losing trust in ourselves. And I think that alludes to something that you talked about in terms of the social media space. It would be fascinating to do that. Well, they will do that study again at the end of this year. And I think we'll be trusting our media a lot more. I think we'll be trusting, let's face it, we may even be trusting our government a lot more, because our government has stepped in. It's going to cost us a fortune, but it's done the right thing in terms of supporting people beyond this. So I just hope that along with this malevolent virus, there's a benevolent virus which spreads, which is about actually when we trust each other, good things happen, and we have to do that. I think the other thing that we also have to recognise now, and I wrote about this in Open, is that when our kids, and this is before Corona, when our kids are so used to having their work out there to a public audience, we've seen that now multiplied, 100-fold. That they're going out, that they're whether it's just digitally the way that you and I are communicating, but they are doing things, they're connecting people up, and that public audience for student work is so important when it comes to motivation.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely massive. I think that's one of the things that I would love to see schools taking advantage of more, is that ability to be able to connect, at least digitally, with an audience who look at your work more than just the teacher who might give it a flick with their red or green pen, whichever one they use.
Yeah, and as this thing was just starting to happen, I was in Australia, and one of my favourite schools is XP in Doncaster, and they just released a documentary that the kids had made about refugees. And what they could do for refugees, and how people misunderstood refugees in Doncaster, and the kids raised money and bought them all bikes, because they live on £37 a week or something ridiculous. And I just thought that these are the kind of examples where we look to our kids who are now informing us through. They had a premiere at the local cinema house, but they've also put it out on YouTube, and it's a really, really moving film. I would urge people to look at it, because it shows what's possible when we trust people, and that's going to be really interesting now to see what's our response going to be. We've seen some awful things happening lately where, understandably people are panicked, they're freaked out. But we're also seeing some incredible things. This applauding the health workers. Yeah. Are we really now going to go back and say, well, porters in hospitals aren't really key workers? I think they are.
Mad.
So yeah. all of that, compassion and understanding for other people, that's all been thrown up in the air, and we have to build on that when this is over.
I agree with that. And so the final question here is, you've got a lot of students who, for better or worse, have got a lot of time on their hands now. A lot of them, might not necessarily be doing a lot of, sort of school work that they've been set, or whether a lot of schools just aren't in the place where they have the ability, to, depending on, the social community that they serve, might have the ability to be able to support their students. Certainly there will be this kind of divide between those who have access to technology and those who don't. But what can students do outside of the school system to sort of develop or showcase their skills? What kind of things do you think that students can do now, which potentially they didn't have the opportunity to do in schools?
Yeah. Well, this is what a large part of my next book is about, really, which is um, how can we collaboratively produce things? Because I think what we've seen is we've shared what we knew, we shared what we owned, through the sharing economy, Airbnb, all of that stuff. Now we're moving into what I think is a fascinating phase, which is that we're sharing what we create, and we're now doing that through the coronavirus at scale. I think in the short term, kids can get involved in that. There are just hundreds and hundreds of mutual aid websites, or if they're more kind of technologically inclined, there's things like Fold It, which is a video game which is actually looking at how this virus might mutate, and by having thousands, hundreds of thousands of people around the world playing this game, they're running simulations. There's, like I said, there's equipment that kids are getting involved in making. So in the short term, there's absolutely no shortage of things to be getting involved in. However, it's been a really difficult time for kids. I mean, how do you explain what's going on to a young 6-year-old? It's incredible, and I think we've just got to go easy on them. And if they just want to be bored and watch Netflix, well, so be it. We can. Nobody's life ever was ruined because they lost 6 months of school.
No, I think that's really important to say, isn't it? That's not going to ruin somebody's life.
No, of course not. Absolutely not. In fact, it would be really fascinating, in 3 or 4 years' time, to look at test scores and exam results to see what kind of impact it's got. I suspect they'll actually be doing better, these kids. But to answer your question, longer term, I think we are moving into an era now where, let's face it, it was going to be hard finding work anyway because of automation. It's going to be even harder because of the recession that's going to hit. But there are incredible opportunities. In the new book, I talk about this thing called the artisanal economy, which we're seeing spreading up. And one of the case studies in my book is Brewdog, the two guys up in Scotland, 10 years ago, were brewing their own beer out the back of a cart. Now they're running a massive corporation, which, by the way, is now, producing hand sanitizers.
Yeah.
They're doing some amazing things. But I think what that is going to mean for our young people is they have to be entrepreneurs. And I don't mean just about making money with that. They can be social entrepreneurs. But they've also got to think, how do I present myself to what is going to be a global audience? We're going to have a global auction for skills now. This has shown us that it doesn't really matter where in the world you live. If you're good, if you've got talent, we'll find a use for it. So I think they're going to have to think about that as well, which is, how do I build my networks? Because this has all happened. All of this incredible response has happened through the building of networks. And we talk about the digital divide, and we talk about kids who are disadvantaged. I think in future, the kids who are not networked, they're not part of these networks, they're the ones who are really going to be at a disadvantage.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of interesting things in there, isn't there? I know that I've spoken to a few head teachers, and I would say they're probably outliers who talk about presentation skills being one of the big things that they really push for, because in a really crowded curriculum, there's not a lot of time for speaking and listening. I think that's a really interesting one. And then the other one, you talk about the networks, and you've mentioned about how you present yourself, but I think there's also a really big opportunity now for kids to understand, or at least develop the digital skills that they need in order to get themselves out there, whether it's producing their own kind of portfolio of skills, saying what they've done, being able to produce a video montage which kind of explains what they did in a certain project. I think like you say, if people, they will be the things that will be in high demand, because if people don't actually know about you, then they can't hire you, can they?
And if this government only fulfills one of its many promises that it made before all this hit, the level playing field of high speed broadband is the one thing I want them to do, because then nobody gets disadvantaged. Because we've seen now, it doesn't really matter where in the world you are, as long as you've got access to a decent broadband and decent Wi-Fi, then you can be a useful member of society. So I think geography is going to matter less, although obviously there are the huge disparities between the north and the south.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, but there's when we've seen so many people now who've been able to work from home, and the world hasn't come to an end, business has continued. People are going to say, do we really all need to be in the same place at the same time? So that there's no way we're ever going to go back to making people all turn up in a big open plan office and be in their little cubicle. That just makes no sense. And we've now proven that it can happen. So therefore, I think you're right. Those digital skills are going to be really critical for our students. Fortunately, most of them are passionate about that stuff, so that's great. We've got to get better as educators at saying, how can we actually turn these tools into things that are socially purposeful?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely spot on. Well, yeah, thank you very much, David. I really appreciate the time that you've taken. I know that it's strange times.
I wasn't doing anything else, Dom.
We've all got open diaries, haven't we?
That's right.
Yeah, but it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you very much for your time and all your thoughts.
And you, and stay safe.
Yeah, you too.
Take care.
I hope you enjoyed that chat with David. Please do follow the links to the CPD tasks, which you can do on your own at home or as part of a staff meeting. And finally, do have a look at the Adobe edX tutorial, where I show you and your students how to put together your own digital CV or portfolio using the free tools in Adobe Spark. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.